Hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you once again for joining us. And it is an honor to have a guest that I have certainly followed closely through the COVID tyranny and chaos that we have had. And it is a delight to speak to him face to face. And that is Mike Yeadon. Mike, thank you for your time today.
Peter, thank you for the privilege and your platform, being able to speak to your audience. As I always say, there's no point in me speaking if there's no one out there hearing. So thank you in turn.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who maybe do not know Mike, although you've probably been living in a dark hole if you haven't come across him, as he fits in with a number of our previous guests. He is a retired vice president and chief scientific officer at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company, and a researcher of immunology and respiratory disease, along with many other things. But that can be the short version. Now, your background in Pfizer, I was shocked to see the numbers of Pfizer there. I'll just give our viewers some of the stats. Net income, 13 billion, revenue, 50 billion. The company's market cap is 250 billion, which places them, I think, around Finland, around number 40 of world countries. So it is a huge organization. And I guess the primary goal is to make money for shareholders. It's not a charity. Is that a fair observation, Mike?
Yes, no, that's true. Just so briefly, you are right. So I've worked in biomedical R&D, sort of new drug discovery, research and early development all of my life, 32 years. And in addition to the time at Pfizer, for about 10 years, I was an independent. So I acted as a board level advisor to 30 venture finance startup companies, mostly in the US, and I ran my own biotech for 6 years as founding CEO. So I raised money, built the team, we did a clinical trial and got bought by Novartis wholly. And at the time, Novartis in Switzerland was the world's biggest drug company. So they jockey for the number 1, 2, 3 slot. It's either Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Pfizer. So yes, the joke was that I lived in a dirty snowball. So when I started in the industry in 1988, I joined a little outfit called Wellcome Research in Beckenham, Kent, and had a rather lovely country house that had previously been the home of Sir Henry Wellcome, who founded the company 100 years earlier. And during my career, the companies just kept buying each other. And they kept buying each other partly because the financial incentives drove them to do that. They would rapidly grow their revenues. And although they would combine R&D outfits, they would usually basically fire half of them. And so research and development became a slightly smaller part of revenue, and you end up with these enormous combines. And essentially, companies like Pfizer they're really commercial sales organizations and treasury. They don't even make that much of their own drugs. A lot of things are done through contract manufacturing, contract clinical trials, and even contract research. So my last foray before I retired in 2017 was a case in point. I'd been a victim of downsizing in 2011. Pfizer, instead of spending all of the money it was spending on internal R&D, was banking the savings, running the radar. If it saw anything good, like Novartis did, you just shoot out a tentacle and pay too much. You just buy it. Yeah. And you'd buy it when it got past the level of risk that you thought was right for your organization, and then run it through the clinical trials. So we've ended up with a smaller group of very large combines, and some people would joke that they're really country-sized banks with like a sweet shop on the side, or a drugstore on the side. That is pretty much it. So I think I was fortunate in that pretty much all the people I worked with in the research end, we were always motivated to identify what had gone wrong in disease, what we could do to fix it, and how you could intervene with some kind of a drug to bring about that benefit without hurting people. That's really what pharmaceutical R&D is about. And a guy who was involved in 2 successful drug discovery programs, that was histamine H2 antagonists. They were the early antihistamines, and beta blockers. That guy called what's his name? Anyway. How was his name? Sir James Black, Jim Black, Scottish pharmacologist, and I met him when he was probably 80 something, and he used to say with a twinkly eye, all you people in the room, all you scientists, it's from here or nowhere that the new drugs will come. And he said, you know what? It's the last really important, truly organized game for adults. And I like that. It's not easy. You hardly ever are successful. A lot of failures. So my training then covered lots of fields: pharmacology, toxicology, biochemistry, and then all of the molecular biology that is more recent. And I was always driven to understand the science, work with people, find new molecules, bring them forward, trying to integrate how do we fix either a cause or a symptom that's important in a disease and not hurt people, and then develop drugs properly. So here's the criticism. So I'm probably the most famous anti-vaxxer in the world, which is absurd, of course. I mean, it's literally, I spent my entire career in this industry. But when I complained about something, at the end of 2020, I wrote an open letter to say you should, under no circumstances, take these alleged vaccines. They've not been developed properly. They are dangerous. I was immediately smeared by the wonderful BBC. But I struck back by cancelling my license. You see, I'm not without any power. But up to that point, I've not made any public, up to COVID, I've not made any public comment about anything apart from my own professional field. So in the area I was working in, I've not campaigned to save the polar bears or protect trees or get rid of cars. I really lazy. I've not done anything. So how I suddenly turned up to protest? Well, there are two possibilities. One is I've suddenly turned out to be this crazy campaigner. The second one is Yeadon's used his entire lifetime's experience and has spotted things that are seriously wrong with what's going on. And it's obviously the second one. But nevertheless, the BBC attacked me. People I used to respect, people I'd listened to, actually put together programs that then, were really pretty unpleasant. But I don't mind that now. I'm well past that. So
whenever someone types in your name, you get pages of fact checks. Exactly. Obviously, that has, and yet you're still going.
Yes, and the reason I'm not. So here are the things that people say about me. What do they say about me? Oh, yes. They say embittered former employee. That's one. The other one is a graft. Is it a grifter? You make money.
Yeah, make money.
What's the third one? They say, oh, yes, he's seeking the limelight. So let's take those in order, shall we? So I left Pfizer in 2011. I was probably their most successful chief scientist. That is, everyone else but me had been fired at some point. And I remember chatting with the penultimate guy. And then he got fired, and then a year later it was my turn. So I was okay. I was okay at my job. But they closed the site I was working in Sandwich in Kent. And so with 2,500 other people lost my job. They were very kind to me when I left. I was one of the last employees out trying to help others get jobs. So I left on good terms. A year later, I came back with a proposition, which they took me up on. And so from 2012 to 2017, Mike Yeadon and his investors and Pfizer were collaborating. That does not sound like an embittered former employee. And at the end of 2017, Peter, we got bought by Novartis, Pfizer cashed out and made a lot of money, and we did all right. So the story, and you can look this up. So John Lamattina, the former president of Pfizer's R&D, the worldwide head, wrote me up in Forbes magazine in 2017 in a very flattering way. So if anyone wants to debunk the fact checks, you can go and check me out. I was a good guy, and they liked me until 2017. So the next one, grifter. I resent that. I've made 0 pence in the work I've done. I've refused gifts. I don't take donations. I don't charge for anything. I've no idea how you would make money out of this. Really. So I've made 0 pence, and it's cost me a large 6-figure sum to do it. And I'm doing it because I'm trying to warn people about what the hell is going on. And I also resent that my former employer that I never suspected of being a criminal entity is at this point a serious criminal entity. Then the last one, oh yes, liking the limelight. No, anyone who knows me knows that my preference is to be in my shed with my motorbikes. Which I've left behind, by the way. I'm now in the States because I figured I could probably keep protesting longer in Florida. I'm not sure whether that was right or not, but here we are. And so where are we? Where are we now?
Well, because one thing you said about a company wanting to do good, obviously Pfizer, the whole thing about trying to suppress data. That should give the public a different view of these companies. So yeah, tell us Tell us why that's happened.
Well, yes, just there's no question. I don't actually think it is Pfizer that wanted. Well, it's not Pfizer that made the specific request to hold back the basically the filing that they made with, I think, FDA, Food and Drug Administration. They assess whether or not a drug is safe and effective, whether it should be authorized or approved. I think someone put in a request for that information, that dossier, to be released, and I don't see why it shouldn't be. Yeah. But I think the FDA were the ones that said, look, it's going to be too difficult for us to give you this dossier, which is absurd because it's a big file. It's literally a very big file. It probably fits on a terabyte drive or something like that. And so they said, look, it's going to take us 75 years. So I don't think it was Pfizer that said it'll take 75 years. Yeah. But the idea that there were no conversations, I think, would be utterly naive, given, I'm afraid, the FDA, the CDC, the drug companies, I'm afraid our MHRA in the UK, are all completely corrupt, and I can prove that. There are numerous ongoing court cases. So there's Pfizer and other drug companies occasionally breached various laws that were pretty serious, and I think Pfizer paid the largest criminal fine. So they weren't fined for having inadvertently harmed somebody, for example, because that could happen. No, they paid the largest fine. I think it was $2.6 billion. I was there at the time, and like other scientists, I can assure you, we were not happy to discover that our employer had been found in court of law guilty of doing something that was so bad it was a criminal offence. I think essentially they had covered up harms in order to make money, I suspect. And they weren't alone. A couple of years earlier, Merck had done almost exactly the same, and they've been slapped with a $1.5 billion fine. So maybe we were naive. Yeah, all right, we were naive. But we didn't see evidence of corruption around us. We were our own best critics, Peter, I promise you. If we thought a fellow scientist had a project that was a lame duck, we would say, your project's a lame duck, Dave. Sally, you've got to stop this. You're using up our resources, and we want to get our drug going forward. So we were pretty good at holding each other to account, but research and commercial almost never met. You might meet for a strategy meeting once a year. That's it. So the idea that one would miss the corruption because we're stupid, you just don't see it. You're working in a research lab, and you have different incentives than the people that are making money, selling. I don't know. They probably arrange deals with health management organizations and hospital groups, and I don't know how it works, but you can imagine there's all sorts of incentives to get your drug prescribed, not another one. We weren't happy, but I never would have suspected that they've done what they've done. So shall I just outline? I can just outline. Let me outline in brief. It's not a good story. So if anybody's been following me on and off, I would say if my story has changed a little bit over time, yes, it has. It's because it's not my crime. So I'm like a detective, a scientific detective, and I'm working out what I think is going on. Every time I speak, nothing I say is inconsistent with any of the major observations. If it is inconsistent, as a scientist, I've got it wrong, right? That's the way researchers taught me, a wicked lesson. If you think X and Y is happening, but you've left out an important series of observations, my God, you're wrong. So, and you get caught out. So if my story has evolved, it's because I've learned new things, or like a jigsaw that I don't have the box, so I don't know what the picture looks like. I've turned it around and think, oh my God, it fits together differently. So here's what I think, briefly, what has happened. It's quite easy. The powers that be, I'll call them the perpetrators, people running this global crime. It is a global crime to take over all of humanity. What they've done is they pretended that there was a serious new respiratory viral health threat. Okay, that's what they did. This virus in Wuhan. In my opinion, there never was an exaggerated. There was never any new health threat whatsoever. Partly the beauty of this, it can't go wrong because there's no moving parts. There's literally the only moving part is the PCR test. So the initial thing, an exaggerated health threat. Now, some people believe there's a new virus, but if so, it's not any more serious than influenza, not really, because flu vanished at the same time by sheer coincidence. Personally, I actually have come to the conclusion, and I will credit Andrew Cowan and his colleagues. I had a really good chat with those guys early in 2020, and it bothered me. I realized over time I could no longer maintain my understanding of respiratory viruses as I thought I knew them. And then I learned a new bit of information recently, and it collapsed the possibility that respiratory viruses as described exist at all. They don't. People do get ill. People are ill. People have exactly the same illnesses, Peter and your listeners, exactly the same illnesses as before that horrible Yeadon said viruses don't exist. They still have, quotes, colds and, quotes, flu. It's just, I think we don't know what causes them, and they're not respiratory viruses. But let's put that to one side. The first big crime was to lie to you and to tell you, that's the collective you, including me, that there was a massive big health threat coming out of China. And my God, you're gonna have to watch it. It's killing all these people. Remember the man falling on his face in Wuhan? Yeah. I mean, come on, folks. Yeah. You know that was fake, don't you? Because it's never happened anywhere else. It's never happened where you live. It's never happened on your TV set. It was fake. Now, I always say to people, what's the right number of times a public health message should lie to you about something that could damage your health, your life, your ability to respond to threats? The answer is 0, isn't it? So when you catch them lying once, it's bad enough, and I can prove they've lied 8, 10, 12 times. So that's the first one, an exaggerated health threat that didn't really exist. Why did they do that? It's so they could get you to accept part 2. Part 2 was to impose so-called measures, which you've come to know and hate or know and love: lockdowns, masks, social distancing, hand washing, border restrictions, school closures, business closures. There are probably some others, but that's pretty much it. I don't know if you know this, but I'm going to tell you, Peter, and your listeners, every single one of those potential interventions, they're called NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, every single one of those has got some plausibility about them if illness is transmitted from person to person, which until a few months ago I thought was true. But if that was true, we would have expected them to have found use in the past during pandemics, epidemics, and so on. The WHO, they're not all corrupt. The leadership is, but they're not all corrupt. Their scientists did a review of all of the non-pharmaceutical interventions I've just listed, every one of them, and they issued a report over 100 pages long in 2019, which they issued to all the member states. So you can go and find this. I had to use the Wayback Machine, and I needed help because I'm no good at it. I got hold of a copy of that report. You read the report. None of those measures do anything at all, it seems, to the transmission from group of people to group of people, person to person. None did anything at all. And that's, I think we're coming to believe that as well, that lockdowns, people thought, oh, it's a necessary evil and it damaged the economy and civil society, but it was necessary. No, it didn't do anything. We knew that through formal published literature in June, July 2020. And by the way, our WHO scientists have reviewed and told every public health department in the world that it didn't work. They all did. Masks didn't work. Hand washing didn't work. The only ones that can be useful are, if you are symptomatic, stay away from other people until you're better. And I think people do that for 2 reasons. One, they're ill. If people are really symptomatic, coughing, shortness of breath, wheezing, and so on, they're so ill they'll lie on the sofa or in bed, or if they're elderly, they might even end up in hospital and they might die. So no one needs to encourage people to stay at home if they're really symptomatic. You don't need to encourage them, but that would be the only one of the measures that made any sense. They didn't even bother to tell us that. They did all the other things, like healthy people not interacting. But anyway, so first was the exaggerated health threat, which was not real. And then the second one was a welter of interventions that got in the way of living your life. They also got in the way of normal economic commerce. And unfortunately, there was a purpose to that. Many people have worked this out now. The purpose of that explicitly, it was twofold. One, to condition people. Would they accept the orders from public health officials led by the politicians in their country? And those of you who've, as I have done, I'd never heard of the Stanford prison experiments. I'd never heard of the Ash conformity study. And I've never heard, there's one other famous one as well, where Milgram experiments. Now, these are all famous bits of psychology that were done in universities, good universities in America after the war. You can look them up. The Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram experiment, and the Asch conformity experiment. What they show is that people will do awful things, including to their fellow citizens, if the peer pressure is sufficiently high and an authority figure tells them to do it. And this explains, I'm afraid it's largely the explanation for how Nazi Germany worked. Basically, people were told to do things by authority figures, looked around, hardly anyone was arguing, and so they went along with it. And that's what's happened here. So that was part of it. It was like, get people used to doing what they're told. We don't care what your reservations are, you're going to do it. And then they also used the media to amplify anyone who was resistant was a granny killer, all this sort of stuff. And then they would have Watch Our Eyes, I can't remember. There were all these sort of ghastly, Laura
Dodsworth.
Great book called State of Fear.
Yeah.
So reading all of that stuff and then researching those experiments there, they're horrific in how pliable we are as species. So I think all of the measures put in place to test your resolve, and most of us, I'm afraid, we are herd creatures. We are like sheep. We don't like to make fuss. We like to do what our peer group is doing, especially within a family group or neighbours or work, things like that. So that was partly, I think it's called entrainment. You'll do what you're bloody told. And the other one was to smash the economy. That is, you can't go to work, so but we won't let you starve. So what we'll do is just print money and give it to you. Now, if you do that, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I'm clever enough to know that if you do this for more than a short period of time, you will dilute the value of your currency to a point where people will lose confidence that your government can repay the debt, especially when the money was created. This is the interesting thing. I thought the debt was being created rather like after the global financial crisis, by the way, and I'm not saying this, but I'm saying this is what the financial experts told me in conversation. They said, oh, you do know that was deliberate and synthetic, that the conditions were created to make that happen. I said, no, I didn't know that. They said, oh, yes, it definitely could have been avoided. And why was it done? And I said, I have no idea, tell me. And it's like, well, how do you think people would have accepted the lockdowns if we weren't used to the idea of open-ended financing? And I thought, you could be right. So I'm not saying it's right, but that's what someone who spent as long in the city as I have in R&D told me that. Someone was like Morgan Stanley or something like that, a currency trader. They said it was all fixed. And then the recovery, all fixed. So we got used to the idea that governments can just print money and we'll put it on the never, never, and then we'll have an argument about intergenerational transfers. But they didn't do that. In 2008 onwards, they did financing by issuing debt. So a promissory note. So we'll issue a debt note for £1 trillion, and it's like, I promise to repay that debt with interest, very, very small amounts of interest in the future. That's not what they did this time. What they did is they literally did direct monetary financing. They created the computer, the money, and ping, sent it to the treasury, I think. Yeah. So that's as dodgy as it sounds, folks. And if you're not telling people how much funny money you've just printed and issued, guess what? People lose confidence in money, your money. They lose confidence in what are called instruments denominated in your currency, so stocks and shares and government gilt certificates, things like that. So the purpose of the lockdown was to entrain you and also to just open the throttles and just blow everything we've been doing, we should have done properly for the last 100 years. They deliberately did it differently. I mean, spectacular sums of money. I think someone told me that 40% of the United States dollars that are in existence today were created in the 18 months after the beginning of the pandemic. 40% of all of the dollars in the world, and it's the world's reserve currency. There's going to be a controlled demolition of the financial system, and they'll go, it wasn't our fault, it was the pandemic, and we'll have to rescue you with electronic money. And Rishi Sunak and every other central bank governor is talking about central bank digital currencies, which to all intents and purposes look like your bank account, but there's two main problems with it. One is there's no cash, so you've no exit route. You can't say, I'm not happy with my £2,000 in my checking account. I'm going to go and get it out over the next few days and keep it in my bedside drawer, just in case. So you can't. There's no cash. There's no cash alternative. And then the other one is the central government or whoever. It won't be our government, by the way. It'll be a supranational database company, probably Amazon Web Services, will control every person's digital bank account on the planet. If they decide to restrict you, basically you'll live life by permissioning. So if you want to buy something in the future, you will have to present your digital ID, and the system will decide whether you can make this transaction where you are now. And so basically, if they don't want you to be able to buy petrol, you won't be able to buy petrol. If they don't want you to be able to spend anything when you're, say, 10 miles from home or more, you won't be able to spend anything 10 miles from home or more. That's why 5G is so important. Yeah. I don't personally believe it's a death ray, although maybe I'll find out it is a death ray. But at the very least, it's a control grid is being built, Peter. So the lockdowns were there to entrain us and to also fatally damage the economy so that they can collapse it. Then there's the third part. There's the third part. We should